Talking about cameras.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Darwood and I'm involved in sustainable building in and around the Islington area.
Could you explain to somebody what a sustainable building was?
Sustainable building is a building that leaves a much lower imprint on the environment than a current building would. In terms of environmental imprint, however you measure that from the carbon footprint of the building, energy efficiency within it, how much it costs to run the building, and obviously the types of technologies to use. So a sustainable building would tend to be insulated to a far higher standard than a standard building. You'd often then draw different technologies that are sympathetic with the environment in which the building stands.
Do you go to a company to get it done?
Most people in relatively small scale projects at the moment tend to be sorting out building their own projects.
What other elements are normal for a sustainable building?
An obvious one will be energy usage, especially at the moment in the current climate. So insulation, things like green roofing, grey water collection, sourcing power, trying to get as off-grid as possible, both gas and electric. So use of solar powers, things like that. Sometimes micro generators that can be run on biofuels, these sort of things, more sustainable ways of generating the power. That's if you're retrofitting, so you can do this stuff. If it's a brand new build, then down to every timber used, production of the nails, screws, paints, making sure they're all organic and don't in any way degrade the environment. You can be fully sustainable 100% right the way down to a percentage of sustainability, especially when you're retrofitting, or if you're trying to make an old Victorian house with original sash windows more sustainable, then obviously that's a lot harder. Things like the types of insulation, the sort of spaces you have to put in cavity insulation, things like that, will be relatively limited compared to, say, a more modern straw bale house with walls that are sort of almost 3 feet thick.
If people want to learn how to build sustainable buildings, how could they do that?
There's a whole variety of courses at the moment, more formalised courses like at the Centre for Alternative Technology, even through the WOOF network, things like that. So you can do weekend courses, week courses, right the way through to these days full university courses that will teach you in more environmentally sustainable construction.
Could you join a community build, say?
The best way, I think, in general, especially if you're not quite sure about how committed you are to it, is to do voluntary work, go with existing community organisations, and then from there find out if it's for you and exactly what your skills are, because what they'll often do is help teaching things like general hand skills, how to use a saw, how to use a drill, screwdrivers if you've never used them, right the way through then to the types of technologies that are being used, and that way you get to see how they're implemented as well. Obviously the more time you're there, the more you tend to learn. As you see different layers of the building going in and going up, you get some idea then of how it goes together, and also talking to people, networking. A lot of people seem to believe or be under the illusion that making a wood frame house is a question of cutting it and nailing it together, which obviously it really isn't. There's a whole variety of putting things together, so if you're not used to any kind of manual work in general, you need to build up the necessary fitness, if nothing else, and obviously the hand skills with tools to be able to have a higher input on your own construction. Obviously the more you can do, the more you tend to save cost.
That would be a good way for young people to learn these skills.
Yes, with a lot of people in that sort of 20s, 30s bracket who are starting to think in a more environmentally conscious way as to what can you do within the context of your own house, your own garden, etc. to take part. So for example, if you're trawling through the internet and books, you might hone in on specific technologies you've heard about. Obviously when you're in an environment surrounded by people who are quite stoked up about this, you start to hear about other things, other ways of doing things that might be more or less appropriate or that you just prefer. So it's much easier then to start to feel you that way. Maybe spend a year or so first being a committed volunteer, and then from there learning necessary skills and so on to be able to go it alone, if you like.
Is a house that's sustainable more expensive than a normal house that gets built?
There's no doubting that. It's always more expensive, and hence I've been banging on about cost a bit, because that always is a prohibitive factor for a lot of people if you're on a tight budget. So then you can decide if you go 20% sustainable, 60%, or like a lot of organic paints can be quite pricey. Whereas these days, a lot of sustainably managed timber isn't as expensive comparatively as it used to be. Where you can pay a little bit more on the timber. Things like insulation is always worth paying out with me, and you get what you pay for to quite an extent. But that's relatively cheap as well, so you're only looking at 10-20% more on the cost.
What's your favourite sustainable building materials?
It's got to be properly sustainably managed oak frames with straw bale. Ceiling roofing, yeah.
Ben Law's famous house in that area. Is David Cameron's turbine on his house a useful addition?
I would actually say it is. As to whether it's necessarily cost effective at the moment is one thing, but over time I think these will prove themselves a lot more cost effective. It's often for one-off expenditure of a few £1,000s, especially at the moment where they're talking gas bills could be coming in at about £1,500 a year for your average family. Obviously you can do the calculations, you soon start earning that back. It's becoming more attractive as utilities are getting more scarce, obviously prices of oil, things like that as well. You know, it's a bit of peace of mind, it's quite a big symbol of the fact that you're dedicated to relatively low impact living.
If people want to join you, how do they contact you to join on a community build set?
Through the Highbury Builders Collective would be the best way.